Okay, welcome everyone to the tunes of the Berkeley Campanile, which you can probably hear in the background. So we're looking very much forward to another live conversation in our series Archives of Migration, which my colleague Elizabeth Krimmer at UC Davis and I started in 2020 under pandemic lockdown conditions. And we are continuing this venture on Zoom because it enables us to engage in transcontinental conversations across time zones without needing to travel. So some of us are here on campus at Berkeley. Sultan Doughan is joining us from Boston, and Deniz Utlu is joining us from Berlin, Germany, where it is already late in the evening, right? 9 p.m. So thank you both very much for making time to be with us today. And thank you, of course, also to all our listeners out there. The topic of today's conversation corresponds with a multi-campus graduate seminar on interrogating the archive that I'm co-teaching with colleagues at Minnesota and Bochum this semester. So welcome to all participants in Minnesota, Bochum, and or wherever you are. And there is also resonance with our electronic journal Transit's last issue on archival engagement, which features a cluster of articles on the Turkish-German archive, co-edited, assembled by guest editors Ela Gezen and Mert Bahadır Reisoğlu, with contributions by Sultan and myself. And the managing editor of Transit, Elizabeth Sun, is also with us today. So, so the language of archives, resonates on various levels for us at this point. So I would like to thank the German consulate in San Francisco for its continued support for this series of literary conversations. Thanks are also due to the Institute for European Studies and the German Historical Institute Pacific Regional Office, which is here on the Berkeley campus. In particular, Heike Friedman and Ray Savard, who have provided invaluable support with the organization, publicity, and all the behind-the-scenes Zoom hosting for this series from the start. We could not stage these conversations without you, Heike and Ray. Thank you very much. So our conversation today will be in English with some German reading passages, maybe even some Turkish interludes, who knows. The audience will have the opportunity to ask questions via the chat or also raise their hands and talk in either of those languages. So let me get to introducing our guests. Our guest author today is Deniz Utlu. He is an author, a writer, a playwright, editor, and also a human rights researcher, an economist, I should add. He also founded a literary magazine, Freitext, which he edited from 2003 to 2014. And his first novel, The Ungehaltenen, was published in 2014, this book here. And was also adapted for the stage at the Gorki Theater in Berlin. where he continues to host a series of literary conversations titled Prosa der Verhältnisse. Then he also co-authored a play that was staged at the Gorki, Fahrräder, könnten, eine Rolle spielen, based on transcripts of the NSU, the first parliamentary hearings on the NSU murder series. His second novel, Gegen Morgen, Toward Morning, just published in 2019 and also just translated into Turkish, as we heard. And he, both of these, we might hear short excerpts from both of these books more toward the end of our conversation today. His essay, important to mention, his essay, Das Archiv der Migration, which was first published in der Freitag, October 31st in 2011, is particularly pertinent to our series, and it was kind of quoted all across that latest transit issue that I mentioned by several authors. We're looking forward to getting into a conceptual discussion on archives of migration with him. So Deniz lives and works in Berlin, and he is the recipient of the Alfred-Döblin-Preis 2021 for his novel in progress, Ursprung, expected to be published next year in fall. Is that right, Deniz? Yeah.
The expectation is correct.
The expectation is correct. So then the Döblin-Preis is actually, you told me, the only prize that that is given to works in progress, manuscripts.
For novels.
For novels, okay. Mm-hmm. So yes, congratulations.
Thank you.
So Deniz studied economics and has been working for the past 10 years as a researcher and policy advisor at the German Institute for Human Rights, Deutsches Institut für Menschenrechte, where he has published multiple studies on topics like trade in raw materials, supply chains, risk calculation, and human rights. One essay published in the FAZ grew out of his work on a research trip in Colombia. So you can actually find these studies online, and this work also factors into his writing of fiction on some level, I think. So we can address that in the conversation. So I'm also very pleased to welcome back to Berkeley Sultan Doughan, who holds a PhD in anthropology from UC Berkeley. She is currently the Dr. Thomas Sand Visiting Assistant Professor of Holocaust Pedagogy and Anti-Semitism Studies at Clark University. Did I get that right, Sultan?
Yes, correct.
And there she teaches exciting courses on collective memorialization, desiring monuments, and her work is broadly speaking about memory work and memory politics. It engages the Holocaust and anti-Semitism as symptoms of a longer standing problem with religious difference in Europe. And she's working on a book on converting citizens, German secularism and the politics of Holocaust memory. So I've been in conversation with both Sultan and Deniz for over a decade now in different contexts here in Berkeley and in Berlin. And I'm particularly excited about bringing both of them together in this conversation on how to conceptualize archives of migration and how our conceptualization also arises from archival practices in various domains. So, Sultan, if you would like, Sultan is helping me moderate this session. She is the co-moderator. So if you would like to join the greetings and say a few words, yes.
Thank you so much. Yes, I'm also very happy to be here. Welcome, everyone. As Deniz Göktürk already mentioned, I actually hold a PhD from UC Berkeley from anthropology, but I do consider the German department my second home for many reasons, for many good memories, and also for the kind of space that Deniz as a professor actually made possible for us grad students, and I would say also for the undergrads, to work on many questions from an interdisciplinary perspective, but always related back to the question of migration, movement, also cultural and archival practice. I think that was always at the core of all of this. And I have to say, I am grateful to Deniz, who I think is one of the very few people I speak and think with in 3 languages, which always makes thinking, makes it go longer and more complicated. But I am really grateful to Deniz for having established Transit as a journal that actually transgresses disciplinary boundaries, and for having trained generations by now of students who are confident enough to speak about anthropological matters, social matters, cultural matters, but also matters of politics of migration in general. So I really look forward to this joint venture together today with Deniz Utlu.
Thank you, Sultan. That's good to hear. Let's start with Deniz Utlu, who published this essay, Das Archiv der Migration, back in 2011, which was quoted, as I already mentioned, by various authors contributing to the latest Transit issue. And 2011, so in the year when the 50th anniversary of the labor recruitment treaty between Germany and Turkey was being commemorated all across Germany in various cities. And that year, das Ballhaus Nauninstraße in Berlin-Kreuzberg staged a festival with the very cheeky title Almancı, 50 Jahre Scheinehe, 50 years of sham marriage. So this festival, and Deniz was one of the people who, one of the curators of this festival. And this festival offered an impressive spread from the Turkish-German archives, engaging in this collective memory work. Many writers, theater makers, filmmakers, residents of the neighborhood. I was also invited, so that's where we first met. So more recently, so that's the 2011 project, but more recently, Deniz, you've been engaged in another archival project, dichterlesen.net, thinking about new forms of presentation for an archive of literary sound recordings. So together with Marica Bodrozic, you designed an audiovisual parcours titled Unterhaltungen, deutscher, Eingewanderten, with a framing essay, Die Sprache des Archivs. So could you tell us a little about this platform? What is an audiovisual parcours and all that?
Yes, a big pleasure, with pleasure. But I want to say also that it was a very good decision in 2011 to invite you to Ballhaus Nauninstraße, because ever since then we're, of course, was a lot of time in between where we don't talk, but ever since then we are in a dialogue, and I feel that this is really, at least for me, enriching. So That is great. And yeah, someone posted the Dichterlesen page already in the chat. I will share my screen with you.
Mm-hmm. We'll get a walkthrough through this audiovisual parcours.
Exactly. Maybe I show you first the general page, because this is interesting as well. Mm-hmm. This is dichterlesen.net, which is a homepage in collaboration of the Deutsches Literaturarchiv Marbach, mm-hmm. And the Literarisches Kolloquium Berlin, and some other organizations as well, but especially those two. They started it initially. Here it is, Literarisches Kolloquium Berlin. So the Deutsches Literaturarchiv Marbach is like one of the most, or the central literature archive for German-speaking literature. You will find there many like original work, facsimiles, and also sound recordings of readings since the 50s. And the Literarisches Kolloquium Berlin is a place where literature events take place, but also where writers also can have a scholarship to be a resident there for a couple of months, and then there are workshops for them. And they also have an archive with readings with the sound of writers such as, Max Frisch and even Paul Celan, and for instance also Zafer Shenojak when he was in his late 20s, a poet in his late 20s. So there's a very rich archive of German-speaking writers, and so the Literarisches Kolloquium and Literaturarchiv Marbach were thinking, what can we do with this archive? Because, it's good to have all this material somewhere in the cellar, but it would also be nice to, share it with the public. But how would you do this when there are like thousands of hours of material? So they have this concept here called Räume. And they designed, or they asked 6 writers to design 3 rooms. It all started with Marcel Bayer and Julia Schoch, and they designed this Raum, Literatur der Mauerrisse, where they picked some readings that are out of the archives and collected them in their virtually in their Raum concerning the fall of the wall and the consequences of it. Then, as Deniz already said, they asked Marica and me, where am I? Yeah, Marica and me, to design a room with the title Unterhaltungen, deutscher, Eingewanderten, which is a title that has a reference to Goethe's Unterhaltungen, deutscher, Ausgewanderten. And then we, Marica and I, we were working separately, and we designed actually 2 different rooms that try to conceptualize the archive material from a literature from a post-migrant perspective on literature. She called her room Die Unendlichkeit der Sprache. And I just stick to the archive. I said, die Sprache des Archivs. Maybe this is like enough as an introduction, or should I scroll into into the archive itself, Deniz.
Maybe why don't you show us a very brief clip from that part, from that flash mob?
Okay.
How about that? And then we go into the translation.
Okay, so let us have a quick look into the archive. Like you have those introductions. I have here you see the chapters. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 chapters. And we will hear some excerpts of the introductions into those chapters, I think,
in
the
English.
realm of this talk here. And so it was very difficult, you know, to decide how to, like, which talks should I choose from the last 50 years. And how should I conceptualize them? And so I decided to have some topics. One is also called the Literature Archive of Migration, as opposed to das Archiv der Migration from 2011. So the focus on literature here. Then, you know, the non-existence of migrant literature, a post-colonial perspective on Germany, and then a new perspective or a more open perspective on national history, and then the question of identity. And just to say a couple of words to the first chapter, in my point of view, Elias Canetti is the first German-Turkish writer to hold the Nobel Prize. He was, I think it was 1984, I think so, at least the 80s, when he received the Nobel Prize. In his novel Die gerettete Zunge, he describes how his mother and him were on their way during the Second World War from, I think, Bulgaria to Vienna, and then they, you know, there was a passport control, and the police searched everything they had, opened up their suitcases, and looked at everything, and the mother was very angry about that and said, this only happened because of our Turkish passports. And so Elias Canetti then was he was I think 8 years old when he learned finally German. He grew up with Ladino, the Jewish Spanish language, and he also knew as a child some Bulgarian and Turkish, which he later forgot. And then he learned German when he was 8 and became a German-speaking writer. And when he was very old, he received the Nobel Prize. So, and then there are a couple of other examples, and then there are also, as you can see, those parts where the pictures are missing out. And these are the loopholes of the archive. Die Lyrik der Gastarbeiter. There is, of course, nothing about Die Lyrik der Gastarbeiter in those archives. In those thousands of hours of material, you will not find a single minute about their work. And with Gastarbeiter, I don't mean people like Aras Ören or Yüksel Pazarkaya. I mean people who were really, you know, workers in their primary identity and not writers, but who also wrote poems, and they would publish them and like self-publishing as self-publishers, and they would read their poems when they were on vacation in Turkey to their family and friends and stuff like that. We couldn't find anything about that. Only the picture of that you all know of the 1 million guest worker who was actually not Turkish, but I think Portuguese.
Portuguese.
Yeah. And in order to fill this, well, we cannot fill this loophole, but in order to commemorate this loophole, we organized the flash mob in 2011 in the realm of this festival that Deniz mentioned, where we read texts of 3 Ös, Ören, Özdemir, and Özdamar.
Özdamar.
Yeah, so 3 generations, 3 Ös, and maybe we'll have a quick glimpse into this flash mob.
Mm-hmm.
We'll have to see if you hear it. Wait. Can you hear it?
No.
Wir haben eine Stelle bekommen. Und jetzt haben wir uns überlegt, was passiert eigentlich, wenn so ein Arbeitstag war, an den Strecken laut, leise, schreien, jeder muss hier das geht nicht gehört werden. Jetzt hier am Platz, wo es relativ laut ist. Und schauen gleich.
Schon Ende der 60er Jahre, Anfang der 70er Jahre stieg die Zahl der aus der Türkei stammenden Menschen an die Millionengrenze. Die ersten kamen, wollten nicht so recht ins Stadtbild passen. Sie waren existent und gleichzeitig nicht vorhanden. Sind wir tatsächlich Bürger dieses Landes geworden? Sind wir willkommen? Sind wir akzeptiert?
Mutter sagt, du suchst schweigt. Ich schwöre, den Höllennamen schlagen. Wallahi billahi kıyamet ileri koparırım.
Yine ayakları yerden havalandı. Uçması gerek. Yoksa ayakları bir daha yere basmaz dedi. Babam, ben kızıma inanıyorum. O benim aslan kızım dedi. Annem, onu bir oğlu askerin ortasında tek kız olarak yalnız bırakabilirim. Nasıl bıraktıysan öyle bulurum dedi.
Orhan, Ali'yi görecek dedi. Sonra biraz ağladılar. Yine Almanya'da biraz havalansın. Sonra yine geri gelir dedi. İstanbul'da Alman irtibat bürosu.
The girls' voices were extensions of my mother's voice. My mother and I said nothing more. Outside, the sea and the girls were making one hell of a noise.
Okay, so you can watch the rest on your own if you wish to. And maybe I stop sharing my screen right now.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much for that walkthrough. There were already kind of interesting things about the loopholes and gaps in the archive that you said there. So now these 5 parts of this this website, right, with your introductions, constitute an essay, the language of the archive, die Sprache des Archivs, which kind of problematizes those categorizations that we engage in when we talk about the literature of migration. And this essay has been translated into English by 4 doctoral candidates here at Berkeley, all in the graduate program in German here. Annalyn Dollmann, Kyla van Koten, Elisabeth Soon, Faye Jurwit. And to give us a flavor, we decided that they will now read the 2 opening paragraphs of Deniz's essay, The Language of Archives, in their English translation. It's actually interesting. Deniz said he conceived of this text more as a kind of introduction to the website, and only their translation made him realize that it also works as an essay. So with that said, let's hear the text in English in the translation. Kyla, you go first.
No one is born with their mother tongue. It must be crafted. We design it by casting ourselves into the world. This crafted mother tongue is the bedrock of all languages that we learn, all the verses that we write. Any journey is possible from here. Beckett, who first wrote in English and later in French, changed his language, but not his self-crafted mother tongue. Even translation does not equal the transfer of one language into another, but the writer's quest for his mother tongue in a different language. Crafting a mother tongue does not come without violence. Just like the crafting of the self, it leaves wounds. Elias Canetti had to rescue his tongue. Fatherless, stranded between countries, and with an impatient mother who, due to force of circumstance, carves German into his mouth. The tongue is not rescued, however, because Elias Canetti learns German, rather because he, already exposed to injury, manages to cast himself into his mother tongue. For a long time, he does not speak at all.
Great. Lynn goes next.
Poet Celan did not write poetry in the tongue of his murderers. He overcame it. He opened up the word, sealed with blood and soil, to the possibility of encounter. For writers, the mother tongue is a matter of survival. That is why they have many mothers. The mothers are from different times and different places. They're not bound to an epoch or nation. Zafar Shenojag's mothers are called Ibn Arabi, Yunus Emre, and Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, among others. Josefa Oliver's mothers are called Paul Celan, Friederike Mayroka, Federico García Lorca, Fernando Pessoa, among others. Paul Celan's mothers are called Rainer Maria Rilke, Alexander Pushkin, Kabbalah, among others, and so on. Reading also means adopting the poet's mother tongue and looking for their linguistic mothers. Without them, the poets are orphaned, and the reader merely picks them up as an informant. This is a misunderstanding. Even the orphan poet's legacy remains in his lines. He only has little information to offer. 50 excerpts of a fragmented archive are assembled in this listening room. 50 readings with commentary. The selection is subjective and liable to the arbitrariness of the archive. A selection of many hundreds that illuminate several aspects of a phenomenon that exists only because it is being debated: migrant literature. The topics of the listening room are the literary archive of migration, the non-existence of migrant literature, post-colonial Germany, the opening of national history, the question of identity. The richness of these authors whose readings are situated in this listening room naturally ranged far beyond these topics. Their inclusion in the respective sections may indeed be their only connection to the topics. That way, the visitor of the archive can roam the space unencumbered by the reflections put forward here. A literary archive of migration remains fragmented, incomplete, paradoxical, associative, and fleeting.
Great.
Archives can hold on to stories before they disappear. The archive of migration, even the literary one, is invisible. It is fragmented, never complete, highly arbitrary, even paradoxical. It is paradoxical because it adopts a criterion of archivization that is invalid, yet justified. From the perspective of the writer, the criteria of migration seem invalid, since migration does not lead to writing. Rather, it is the writer who balances experience of migration, among other things, through the resolution to write. Yet the criterion become validated because authors or their texts can be orphaned in the context of migration.
And Elizabeth?
A literary archive expands the frames of references for reception if organized with care. To organize with care means not to shelve authors based on the diversity of their migration backgrounds, but to recognize them within their literary traditions. The literary tradition in which these particular authors find themselves cannot be what groups them together in the archive, since these authors have found homes within different literatures, and by that I do not refer to national literatures such as German or French. What I am referring to are the works, wherever they happen to be written, with which authors associate themselves. In this way, the inhabitants of a literary archive are randomly and arbitrarily assembled. Random in the sense that their paths of migration were also, but not always, random. Arbitrary because migration alone does not imply literary connections, and therefore the compilations are left to the subjectivity of the archivist. This paradox cannot be avoided. It must be endured.
Beautiful. Thank you. Paul?
Yes,
Yeah,
thank
maybe.
you. I also want to thank the translators for the translation and the reading. It was, I think these are really beautiful translations. So thank you very much for your work. You really have my respect. I think translating texts is, you know, I tried to translate some poems, and I feel like I never complete the translation, even though if there is a text in the end, it's never like, you know, it's an infinite work. So I really respect the work of translating. And like, let me also include this paragraph, let me also say this. I think the Transit magazine really did an important work here in the last 10 years or even more, because there were texts translated into English and, you know, discussed within seminars and you know, inspired maybe some academic work, which were actually not at all mainstream in Germany. And you know, there were like discussions and texts where people in Germany even wouldn't know what we were talking about, and suddenly we realized, like, wow, and you know, on the other side of the Atlantic, people actually are interested in it and contribute something to that by themselves. And I think this is like, this shows how important such a journal can be, like, be it electronic or be it on paper, whatever. But I think that Transit really did an important work here, and we also collaborated with, at some point, we as Freitext magazine, as a German-speaking literature magazine, asked for collaboration at some point and translated texts into German, and our texts were translated into English. This was my parenthesis.
Yeah, that's excellent. And in fact, you know, we have a contribution in the last issue about literary magazines as archive. But maybe, you know, so Deniz, you actually once told me that writing fiction was a result of a failed archive project. So die Geburt der Fiktion aus dem Geiste der gescheiterten Archivarbeit, right? So maybe you could tell us about that, and also the challenges of categorization that you encountered in designing this audiovisual parcours of migration literature. Because it seems like, you know, sort of from your first essay, Das Archiv der Migration, now you move to the language of archives with more of a focus on the literary and the paradox of operating with this category while at the same time deconstructing it, right? You know, so yeah, maybe a little more about your thoughts and your practice on that front.
Well, you know, the first essay on this topic, Archiv der Migration, was, well, I came up with it at a time when I wasn't necessarily thinking about language. I was thinking about the history and the stories and the people who were living in a certain area and, you know, produced a certain very specific type of living and culture and, yeah, also language, but not primarily. And this was because in Ballhaus-Nauninstraße, I think it was 2009, we were trying to work on, or yeah, we invited other artists to work on a piece of Aras Ören, Was will Niasi in der Nauninstraße. And in preparation, I did some research on the spots that are mentioned in his poem, which are all in the area of Nauninstraße in Kreuzberg, Nauninstraße, Waldemarstraße, Oranienstraße. And I realized that it was really, really difficult to find any information about the life of migrants at that time, even in the archives, like archives not as a metaphor, but, you know, as a place where things are archived, like in the Kreuzberg Museum. I was sitting there for hours and trying to find something, and there was a lot of material on the squats, house squats at that time, on gangs, but not the German Turkish gangs, like gangs in the 30s and 40s that were running around in that area. But there was really almost nothing to find about the German Turkish life in that area, which was dominant, like almost only Turkish people, well, people from Turkey lived there at that time. Because it was a very bad area on the border of Berlin when there was the political East Berlin. Later it was in the center, but at that time it was on the border. And then the houses were, you know, really bad, like they were wet and sometimes not constructed and so on. So it was a very bad place to live. And usually the gas workers and families of the gas workers lived there for decades, and there was really not a lot of material. Then I went to the Nauninritze, which is a place for young people since I think the 80s, maybe even the 70s, I'm not sure. And in their archive, I found some stuff about German Turkish culture in the 80s, but it was usually the perspective of mainstream media. So it wasn't the voice of the people living there. It was the voice of other people talking about them, and I have to say, usually in a disrespectful manner. So like being confronted with this difficulty, not as a conscious decision, but more like, you know, as a emotional reaction or an unconscious reaction, I started actually to write my first novel, and Die Ungehaltenen.
Mm-hmm.
And I connected it to this to this idea of memory and the necessity of memory in order to being able to grieve. And the main character is someone who's losing his father, and he's not able to grieve because wherever he's looking for the story of his father, he will find only the language and the discussions and the perspective of others on the generation of his father.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the way into the archive. And the second question, I think, was
but the paradox that
comes
up at the end of this passage that we just heard, you know, sort of, which is interesting, that we work with categories here that we at the same time feel a need to dismantle, right?
You know, I think that this paradox is actually typical for any work against discrimination. Like, for instance, affirmative action. In order to empower people who are disadvantaged systematically, you use the etiquettes that actually discriminate them. You use the categories that discriminate them, and this has a paradoxical effect because it does not only have a positive effect, it also has a negative effect. That said, I'm totally for the affirmative action, so I don't want to be misunderstood here, but we have to be aware that there are those two effects. And this is also happening with literature and with the categorization of literature as migrant literature, because you find like many different writers, like 50 are in this room that we just had a walk through right now, and some of them wouldn't be called some of those works wouldn't be called migrant literature. I just called them in that room like that, and others would be called migrant literature all the time, but the writers would say, what do I have in common with other writers who by coincidence also have, let's say, a Turkish or Spanish or whatever descendant, but they're in a completely different literature tradition. So it's a sociological category applied on aesthetics, and that cannot work, of course. I mean, that has to fail. But on the other side, if we don't do this, like if we really don't do this at all, some marginalized perspectives will disappear because they are not accepted in their literature tradition, since they're categorized as like migrant or marginalized or whatever. And of course the mainstream literature tradition is not revolutionized by marginalized people. So even if they do revolutionize it, they will not be heard. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit. And so you have to stick this banner on it in order that, in hope that someday when the discussion is opened and we have overcome some structural hurdles, people will be able to see, this is what this guy was doing. That was the idea. Oh, it was about the poetics of Emine Sevgi Özdamar. Oh, wow, Josefa Oliveira was in the tradition of Paul Celan and not only the child of Spanish gas workers. Oh, interesting. So, and that's the paradoxical part.
Yeah, expanding the categories as we work with them. Sultan, you want to take over?
Sure. Yeah, let's talk about failures and failed categories. I think I like how Deniz mentioned that in a way it is a failure, but one that is productive, right? It does something in the world, and for a moment of repair, like which you have called out as affirmative action, you actually build on that failure, right? Based on like the earlier categorization, you invite back in to kind of amend for the situation that was structurally caused. So in terms of failure, to take this further, I was really struck by your novel, Die Ungehaltenen, given that for the longest time I had read and reread Das Archiv der Migration, which had a very kind of clear tone, making a case for an archive that is too dispersed. And I think, your showing of the loopholes in the archive was actually also interesting, because it seems to me that you were kind of pointing your finger on this in that archive of Das Archiv der Migration essay too, that something is not in its right place in a way. And I have to say, I was a bit surprised. I have only recently read your novel, but I was surprised about the protagonist Elias. And the surprise is maybe this, it comes from a place of expectation, obviously, because I've been, as said, kind of thinking of you and your work through das Archiv der Migration, which is a far more provocative essay, right? So it's very rich and has inspired me and Deniz, many of us actually also working on this issue, on the recent issue that came out, to think about how can we account for the practices of migrant archives, right? Migrant, not just in terms of like migrants as people, but migrant as in mobile, moving, transnational, as something that is perhaps far more dynamic than a national archive or like an official archive, right? Mm-hmm. And that I have found ways to think about this through like practices that have combined literature and social concerns. I mean, I think including concern of racism that you just mentioned, and remaining inviting and open to questions that I think still kind of get us going, including like what you were saying earlier about how do you actually account for the cultural production of these authors who come from a certain tradition, but are never recognized as that, but as Migrantenliteratur, Ausländerliteratur even, right? Like the foreigner who writes. So my question is this. So in das Archiv der Migration, there is a clear lamentation, and I think you show that lamentation through an interesting figure of the hamster wheel. Mm-hmm. And I think your point is valid and intriguing. But in the essay, you make that case, and you say, you make the case for the archive, right, in order to escape that hamster wheel. So when I read the novel, I was kind of expecting that. And I was really surprised and curious why you had kind of created this figure of Elias, who really seems to be thrown into certain situations and contexts, but as if he's not of them. He's not embracing them. He refuses engagement of a certain reality around him, including the reality that his father died. And then also like the events that happened that you mentioned and that he finds himself in is something that keeps him really busy internally. But he is often not responding to them. He has thoughts that he produces, text messages that he produces, but then erases, things that he imagines, but then doesn't share. And, you know, when you read the novel, you sometimes think, oh my God, this has actually happened. And then it's not happening because it's in his head. So all of this, in a way, points to something very interesting to me. It seems to me there, and I think this is like where I wonder if you connect das Archiv der Migration with the Ungehaltenen, is that there's a series of events, but there is no ordered past or future that Elias is orienting himself to. Okay, so is he like the lost subject of the missing organized archive? Is he like the man, the product, the next generation of that loophole that you described, right? So how does that absence of an official and maybe centralized archive, I don't know, like that archive that would kind of maybe order him better, organize him better, shape your own writing, right? I mean, like, why have you chosen to go these two ways? Probably because also of the different voices that you could mobilize an essay versus a novel. But what did that do to like your own writing, your own voice, coming up with this fictional figure that in a way takes stock of things, but tells a story without a clear organization? So.
Thank you, Sultan. I think these are really valid and good observations that do not only connect the essay Archiv der Migration with the Ungehaltenen, but also the Ungehaltenen with my second novel, Gegen Morgen, because this this connection of time and space is something that I really try to take on a next level formally with my second novel. So you know, in the Ungehaltenen is, as you really correctly like said, like, you know, one of the main things for me, like when I think of language, what the language does is to erase itself after, you know, to almost at the same time as it's spoken out, and then you know, to actually to create moments where imagination and reality are not very clearly separated or separatable. And I do think that has something to do with the social context that you just described. I will come back to that in a second. And in Gegen Morgen, actually, the whole novel is constructed in that manner. Whereas in the Ungehaltenen, it happens in Elias' head, and then it comes back, and then, you know, you're always somehow coming back to the reality of Elias, to what he's going through. Whereas in Gegen Morgen, it constitutes the whole way of narrating. So I think your observation, like, I find it really helpful also. I'm not sure if I would have seen it that way, but I can connect to it. So your observation really connects those works with each other. You know, when I was writing, or when I am writing an essay, I am usually bothered by something, and I urgently have to say hopefully very clearly what I think of it, and very fastly also. And it's different with the novels. I mean, I have to write it very urgently, but it takes a long time. And then in this time of writing, things change, not only in the world, but also in my mind and in the life of the protagonist. And then the story is somehow, or you don't have to call it story, the world of the novel somehow becomes active and separates itself from what I was planning to do and recreates itself and so on. So it's a completely different dynamic in the novel. And I really do trust this dynamic. I think that that this, you can call it method, that this method of understanding reality delivers other perspectives on reality than, you know, this idea of, oh, this is the observation and I respond to it. And in the Ungehaltenen, you will find someone, Elias, who is beside himself, who is very angry, at least in the first part, like the first half of the novel, because well, he doesn't even know why, but, you know, as we read the novel, we will see it is connected to his disconnection with the society, to what also disconnects him from his father, who just died. And, you know, as it is often the case, we only understand what value someone has to us when he or she is gone already. So when you hope to find some, you know, connection to that person who's gone, and I don't know, in you know, in things that this person left behind, in stories that this person left behind, and the general history of the time that person was living in. But when it comes to more marginalized perspectives, you often don't find those things, like neither in the families nor in the archives. Like even in the families, you would, like, in a, you know, in very bourgeois, rich families, you would have objects that are in this family since hundreds of years, and those objects have stories, and they would say, like, your grandfather used to have this mirror in his pocket when he was, you know, journeying through the Orient. And when it comes to a working class family, which is the case in although it's not 100% clear, there are workers, but they also have studied, so there are also other stories of marginalization in there, not only a class issue. When it comes to, well, let's say also to migration, you often don't have those objects. And then, you know, in the lack of those, with the lack of those objects, you just look around and say, okay, so I want to understand how those people lived. How did my father live? Like, what was his life like in the factory? He never said anything about that. I don't actually know anything. He never talked about it. He just worked. So now I want to know, how was his life like? And then you keep on searching and you will find nothing, because that life wasn't important enough to be told, to be recorded, to be archived, and to be remembered. So I think this you know, leads to this anger and disconnectedness, and also to this reaction of trying to rewrite reality in imagination, which then again has an effect actually on reality by the way the narrator acts.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think what you described is also like what counts as preservation worthy, what is worth to be collected and preserved, conserved, maybe even. Perhaps not just by families, but just like, you know, the way cities are planned and built and erased, right? Or like what kind of statues we actually erect and which ones we just let, you know, neglect. So, so there is certainly kind of an interplay between like what is publicly or officially kind of sanctioned as preservation worthy, and then there's probably also like the necessity of like, what do you keep from a certain life, right? I mean, I think Elia's kind of girlfriend, she keeps these wired little figures that her father made her and brought from the factory, and she thought his job was to make these little Drahtmännchen, right? Which becomes an object of memory. And I actually have two more questions for you. One goes into language, one goes into objects, actually. So maybe let me ask the object question first. Because I think that is really an interesting one that has been a personal question also for me, of like what kind of materials and objects you would consider archival. So beyond language and words, what are the objects? What are particular objects actually that animate migration, German Turkish labor history, and migrant life, right? What do they animate? So I'm thinking, for example, on the other day I saw an old German 100 Deutschmark, right? The blue bill of 100 Mark, which has such an aura, actually, which has a labor migration story to tell, because it's kind of like also like what travels with guest workers to Turkey as like a sign of success. It has symbolic power. It also means you made it, you're making money, you're really working, right? But also, you know, the other side of that story is burnt down houses or houses that were torn down that remind us, I think everyone who is familiar with, you know, migration story to Germany, it has racist aspects. So I was wondering, how do such materials and matters figure for you? I mean, they emerge in fleeting in the novel, but when you, for example, go and look for archives and say, you know, I couldn't find anything about this time in Naunenstraße and surrounding that Ören describes, what are the other things that you would be looking for that pop up, for example?
I think any object can be in such an archive, and in the Naunenstraße and in Kreuzberg particularly, I think those archives were more private and not even, named as archives. So in the basements of people living in those houses, and you would find there, for instance, many objects that were bought in order to be used in an imagined future life in Turkey, but never made it to Turkey. They, stayed in their packages in the cellar, and then the time changed and you wouldn't need them anymore, or new stuff was out there, and then you would have a toaster from the 80s packaged up in the cellar, for instance. But also, like, for instance, video material. And I don't even only mean the personal, videos and photos people were making. I really mean like films, like, future films that are difficult to get, or that are not archived, but that were, made was, where people had to find money, where you have professional actors in it and stuff. And I remember this because at the same festival that Deniz was mentioning in the beginning, we also had a curator for films, Tuncay Kloğlu and Osman Tok, and they searched for 50 films for 50 years. 50 films. And some of those films, don't ask me which one now, but I remember that some of those films they could only find because some guy had it in the cellar. Like there wasn't. They knew the film existed because they're like, they have a vast knowledge on film in the context of migration, especially in Germany. So they knew at some point this film was made, but there was no way to find it. And then they found it in the cellar in Nauninstraße. It was actually, the actor also lived in the Nauninstraße, so it was his cellar, but still. There are those things that may look unimportant, but then they tell those stories. And I was like, it's an association right now. I was just in Turkey in Istanbul for some research concerning my third novel that I'm working on now, and I had a journey. I traveled to Mardin at the Syrian border to do some research there, and I met a guy who's working, or who has a jewelry, and he told me that he collects stuff, and I said, like, what kind of stuff? What do you collect? And he said, well, my family and we moved to New Mardin, which are like, buildings from the 70s and 80s, whereas in Mardin city, you have buildings that are 1,000, 2,000 years old, where people used to live. And I have one house in Old Mardin. And in that house, I collect everything old that I find. And then I visited him, and you would see there like old doors. You would see their mirrors, you would see candles, and objects that I didn't even understand what they were. And I asked him, how do you know the story of those objects? And he said, maybe also a little bit in a romantic way, but there was some truth in it. He said, I sit here every evening and I watch those objects, and I wait for them to tell me their stories. And at some point, there is a story, he says. At some point, you start to understand this is a door of an Armenian household. You look into the, what is it called? The key place. And you see that there is a cross in it. And then, you see this and you understand, oh, this is from an old Muslim grave where you see the symbols of, and so at some point you see the stories, and all those objects would have been gone. They would have been disappeared. People renovate their houses, they threw them away, and everything disappears. And one could discuss, why is it so bad that things disappear? Actually, we had discussions like that in Martin as well. But I think there is, you never know which object will tell which story, and that makes it so difficult.
Yeah, beautiful. I think there's also something about what you described earlier, these like, bought items for a future life in Turkey that you would bring back, and you keep them in this package. And in fact, you never go back and you keep this item, and 5 years later, there are new models and just looks so outdated. Just shows us like how there are all these different conceptions and horizons of future for these families who actually kind of like check off these futures, right? It's like these futures that are imagined, but actually never take place, never kind of come into being. So, and what you described with the case in Mardin is like, there are all these objects from the past that yet have a certain agency without the owners or without the people who use these objects to tell the story, to kind of live on in a new, like when we think about archives as fragmented, these objects are obviously fragmented and assembled, but yet they also find new assemblages, right? They find new ways to have a social life beyond like what they started off with. So since you mentioned Turkey and Mardin, I do want to ask you, like, how does Turkish, if at all, when you talk about language of the archive, and you mentioned, presumably Armenian, a door that belongs to maybe an Armenian family or an Assyrian family in Mardin. So how does Turkey figure for you in terms of language, in terms of vocabulary, in terms of something that also has an archive maybe to offer? Is there, because I did not see this in the Ungehaltenen so much, although there's also a trip to Turkey and kind of encounters with friends of friends. I was wondering, is there several, when we think about language, the language of the archive, can we think about multilinguality here? Can we think about also other languages, affective languages? But also, like, what is your vocabulary in all of this? Are there certain terms that you really think with are like your strong concepts, and others that you would just refuse to engage again or reject? And I'm also asking this because what happened in the Ungehaltenen, and I know that you were active in Maxim Gorki and in Naunenstraße. So, I find that theater in the German-Turkish context has sometimes taken on more informative and more performative role to talk about scandalous events like the NSU murders. Whereas in literature and definitely in mainstream knowledge, they're kind of rather subdued or like hinted at, but more mysterious. So there I was wondering, like, how have you again navigated that in terms of like thinking about the languages of archives, but also thinking about things that are said and done in spaces of theater, in spaces of social life, but yet somehow informing your own work?
Again, for me, it's really different to think about the work as a novelist and about the work that I'm doing as a curator in the theater or at a festival or as an essayist or as a researcher. And one reason for this is for sure the timeline that, it's just a novel is just not the right place for quick responses. And also not the right place, I think, to fight for certain concepts and words that are connected to those concepts. So I don't want to say that a novel is free of ideology. I mean, I don't think that anything's free of ideology, but it's not, I wouldn't try to you know, try to translate a concept, a political or philosophical or social concept directly into a novel, although I know that they're sneaking in, and then I try to play with it in the text. And since a novel is nothing else than language, I mean, it consists of language. It does not even consist of. It is language. A novel is language. I think there are several. I think the way different languages, or let's say language, the way different languages come into the text are more complex than just using foreign words, like Turkish words in a German book, for instance. I mean, there can be Turkish words, but sometimes it is more what I like to call the temperature of the language. Like, for instance, if you maybe there is not even one Turkish word in a paragraph, but you have something which you have a rhythm, and you generate the feeling in that paragraph, which is not very usual for the German language. But then it is German language because you've written it in German, so it actually broadens what Zafar Shenojak would call the emotional capacity of the language through maybe the information, the knowledge, the unconscious knowledge of other languages that the writer has in his emotional life, or in her emotional life. So I think this is a way where I'm sure the emotional capacity of the Turkish language that I have primarily learned in interaction with my mother has influence on my let's say poetology. And then, you know, in Gegen Morgen, for instance, I use mathematical formulas, not many, like, you know, it's not that it takes a lot of space in the book, but here and there are a couple of mathematic formulas. And this is also like, I didn't know that was the case when I was doing it, but I realized afterwards that this is also like having a foreign language or another language than the one that the novel is written in the novel itself. And I realized that people were somehow impatient when it came to those mathematical formulas, because they couldn't understand them. And that reminded me very strongly of what I have experienced when talking Turkish in public in Germany. Like, it is sometimes very difficult for people to bear not understanding this language, which also interestingly isn't true for every language, but for certain languages. And when I realized that this is also the effect of the mathematical formulas in a novel, I was very happy to witness that. It wasn't planned at all, but I think maybe this is one of the roots of that poetological decision. One of the roots is maybe having experience to being alternated when talking Turkish in the public sphere. So I think there are many ways, and it's very complex how those languages feed into the literary work. And additional to that, there are also Turkish words sometimes, and even maybe not in those two novels, but in other texts, literature texts that I've written, even phrases and sentences and dialogues.
So at this point, we are we only have 8 minutes.
Thank you so much.
So thank you so. I'm wondering, there were plans to give short readings from the two novels. Maybe we only have time for a very short one from one.
Yeah.
I'll leave that to you, Deniz. As a closing passage, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is one chapter of the Ungehaltenen translated at the transit journals. So then I take one paragraph now, or a couple of pages, 2 pages from Gegen Morgen.
Gegen Morgen, yeah. Maybe I can say just very briefly that this novel is set in 2015. It actually ends on the day after the November 13th Paris attacks at the Museum of Natural History, and ultimately in a state of indecision at Orly Airport.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you were describing in terms of overlapping temporalities of past and present is really formative for this book, these flashbacks. And the story takes the reader back to the turn of the millennium, when the first person narrator Kara and his childhood friend Vince were both students in Berlin, sharing an apartment, where they were joined by Ramon from Hellersdorf, who has a very different formation, socialization, and character. So this trio of placeless drifters, who also then later disperse into different directions, are the key figures. And I think what the novel does is probe the rise of violence in these micro relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And the narrative circles around the value of human life. One quote is eine Ökonomie des Absurden, die vortäuscht rational zu sein. So an economy of the absurd that pretends to be rational. So I feel that's where those formulas, so the quest to also numerically account for the value of life comes in. So I find it a very intriguing book, also in terms of fictionalizing historical events through engagement with personal memory and archives. Okay, with that, let's hear some German.
Thank you, Deniz. I will just read the passage after this attack, which is not, where the novel doesn't say what kind of attack it is, and then the day after that, I would just read 2 pages from the day after that. Auf der Straße blendet mich das Sonnenlicht. Auf der Straße blendet mich das Sonnenlicht, das an kleinen dunklen Wolken vorbeifällt. Mir ist nicht mehr kalt. Ich lasse den Mantel im Vorbeigehen auf einen Kaffeestuhl fallen. Über den Bäumen sind die Wolken ungleichmäßig schwarz, wie Schattenspiele einer großen Winkelspinne, die ihre Beine und ihre Kieferklauen über den Himmel des Quartier Latin spreizt. Auf halbem Weg ausgestiegen, immer. Die Währung der Sterblichkeit misst sich in Solidarität. Wird die Solidarität aufgehoben, ist die Sterblichkeit entwertet. Am Lauf der Dinge ändert das gar nichts. Ich laufe durch den Regen, das Geräusch von Wasser, wie es auf Stein und Kies klatscht. Brüllende Motoren von der Straße her bei jeder Ampelschaltung. Hupen aus der Ferne. Die Winkelspinne ist so groß wie das ganze Viertel. Ein Fuß von ihr füllt die Straße ihrer Breite nach aus, die anderen 7 Füße verteilt sie auf weitere Straßen und Dächer. Die Passanten ziehen die Hälse ein und beschleunigen ihre Schritte. Die Spinne bewegt sich tonlos fort. Man hört nichts, wenn sie auftritt. Auch zerbricht sie nichts, den Asphalt nicht und die grau-blauen Ziegel der Dächer auch nicht. Allenfalls fällt ein Fahrrad um. Ich folge der Spinne. Von der Rue Mouffetard aus, wenn ich in den Himmel schaue, sehe ich ihren Panzerbauch. Die Menschen drängen sich in die Hauseingänge oder verstecken sich unter ihren Regenschirmen. Ich laufe vorbei an einer Buchhandlung am Ende der Straße in ein weißes Café mit großem Hof. Stufen führen hinauf zu einem Garten. Dahinter ein Raum mit Wasserpfeifen und gepolsterten Bänken. Männer, auch einige Frauen, die sich unterhalten. Als ich eintrete, dämpfen sie ihre Stimmen. Ich falle auf ein Polster. Ein Mann stellt ein Glas gesüßten Pfefferminztee vor mich. Die Luft riecht nach Apfel und Tabak. Die Männer schmulen misstrauisch herüber zu mir. Ich schlürfe an einem Tee, behalte das Glas bei jedem Schluck lange am Mund und atme den Pfefferminzdampf ein. Über mir hängt ein Spiegel, der aus vielen kleinen Spiegelmosaiksteinen besteht. Ich sehe mich selbst darin, aus verschiedenen Winkeln auf mich herabstarren. Ich schließe die Augen, wie zum ersten Mal seit Wochen. Nur meine vervielfachten Augen über mir bleiben geöffnet, sie blinzeln unregelmäßig und asynchron, einige starren ohne jedes Zucken. Aus 20 Augen heraus sehe ich mich ruhen, den Kopf im Nacken, die Hände mit Teeglas im Schoß, die Beine übereinander geschlagen. Ich höre jemanden sagen, c'est Dieu qui donne la vie et c'est lui qui la reprend. Die Stimme dringt durch die Wand, an der ich lehne, ich folge ihr. Da ist eine Art Vorführraum, ein Kino im hinteren Teil des Cafés. Es läuft gerade kein Film. Stattdessen haben sich alle einem Mann entgegengebeugt, der mit gedämpfter Stimme spricht. Sie mögen dich beleidigen, sie mögen dich erniedrigen, doch du darfst deine Hand niemals gegen einen anderen Menschen erheben. Die weltlichen Ungerechtigkeiten wird er im Jenseits vergelten, denn er ist es, der Vergeltung übt, er ist es, der Leben schenkt und er allein, der Leben nimmt. Er mag euch auf die Probe stellen, haltet stand. Böse Geister haben diese Kinder verblendet. Jetzt müssen sie rechtfertigen, jetzt müssen sie sich rechtfertigen vor ihm. Verblendung entleidet nicht der Schuld, entledigt nicht der Schuld. Unsere Schuld betrifft alle. In einer Welt der Erniedrigung verlassen die Demütigen ihre Posten. Wo der Tod der einen zählt und der Tod der anderen niemanden kümmert, ist das Leben bereits beschädigt. Ist es dem Erniedrigten zu verübeln, dass er dem Erniedriger grollt? Darüber möge er entscheiden. Es ist nicht meine Aufgabe zu verübeln und auch eure ist es nicht. Aber ich stelle fest, der Erniedrigte hat den Groll in sein Herz gelassen, in seine Lungen gefüllt. Und dann erst kamen böse Geister und verdrehten ihm die Lungen. Böse Geister laufen draußen herum, stehen an der Schwelle dieser Tür und beobachten uns, wandeln umher, spüren den Groll in unseren Herzen. Sie riechen ihn, so wie Hunde Angst riechen. Ihr werdet sagen, aber hätte man ihn nicht erniedrigt, dann hätte er keinen Groll gehegt und die bösen Geister hätten ihn nicht gerochen. Und ich sage, falsch. Über den Erniedriger haben wir noch gar nicht gesprochen. Der hat seine eigene Geschichte, die eine andere ist als die des Grolls. Und hinter der Geschichte des Erniedrigers verbirgt sich wieder eine andere und dahinter eine andere und wieder eine andere. Und das geht so lange, bis wir wieder bei demjenigen angelangt sind, der Groll in sein Herz ließ. Und damit kommen wir hier an, in diesem Raum, bei euch, bei mir. Wir stehen wieder am Anfang. Jemand tippt mich von hinten an. Monsieur, entweder rein oder raus. Das ist kein Zoo. Verzeihung, sage ich. Er nickt.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. So I think we are at the end. There's a lot more we could talk about, but we're out of time. And Deniz also has to eat now. So we thanks to you, Deniz, to you, Sultan, and to everyone who stuck with us. Some people had to leave because they're teaching or going to meetings, but they will, I'm sure, listen to the rest in the recording. And It was a wonderful conversation. Thank you both very much. And we'll stay in touch. Bye-bye.